War and Revolution, section, Talmons Sophism. The fact that in the Black Book, as in an immense literature, the deeds and misdeeds of communism are compared not with the actual behavior of the world it sought to challenge, about which the strictest silence reigns, but with liberalism's declarations of principle. In the light of these, the historical experience that began with the Bolshevik Revolution emerges in all its abjectness. The sophistical character of comparison between such heterogeneous magnitudes is patent. It might be called Talmons Sophism, after the name of the distinguished scholar who, in the aftermath of the Second World War, condemned totalitarian democracy, from Rousseau to Stalin, contrasting it with a liberalism that supposedly abhorred coercion and violence. This appraisal not only completely ignores real history, but also proceeds extremely selectively when it comes to declarations of principle by different exponents of liberalism. As we know, the latter did not hesitate to theorize slavery or despotism for barbarians, not to mention war, and, in states of emergency, made provision for dictatorship in the metropolis. All this is ignored by Talmon, who, when referring to the political tradition he cherishes, prefers to soar into the firmament of hagiography. This manner of argument has triumphed in our day. The tragic history of communism, denounced as the very embodiment of totalitarianism, is set against an idyllic portrait of Britain and the USA, or other countries governed by the liberal rules of the game. But what of such rules in the colonies and in relations with populations of colonial origin? And what of such rules in situations of acute crisis? Marx denounced a key aspect of Talmons Sophism, silence about the colonies, in advance. Quote, "The profound hypocrisy and inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization lies unveiled before our eyes, turning from its home, where it assumes respectable forms, to the colonies, where it goes naked." End quote. After the tragedies of the 20th century, the other key aspect becomes clear: abstraction from states of emergency, starting with that prompted by total war. Let us seek to trace the history of the last 150 years employing Talmons Sophism, but turning it against its usual beneficiaries. Let us start with the present. The Italian judiciary has given vent to suspicions of the CIA's complicity in the Piazza Fontana massacre, and it is now public knowledge that in the post-war period, the USA was ready to intervene at any point to cancel an electoral result favorable to the communists by force of arms. To this, we may add the long list of military interventions in Latin America, often on behalf of ferocious military dictatorships. And now let us read Stalin, who, in 1952, called on communists to pick up the banner of bourgeois democratic freedoms and the banner of national independence, cast aside by the bourgeoisie. These were the years when the communist movement was mobilized in a global campaign to collect signatures for peace and a ban on nuclear weapons. On the other side, by contrast, Truman entertained a radical idea for securing complete victory in Korea, which emerges from a diary entry from January 1952. An ultimatum could be issued to the enemy countries, spelling out in advance that a failure to comply would entail the destruction of the largest cities and, quote, every manufacturing plant in China and the Soviet Union. This was not a hypothetical private reflection. Even after the end of the Korean War, the atomic bomb was brandished against the People's Republic of China on several occasions, and the threat was all the more credible given the fresh, terrible memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Let us proceed backwards. During the Second World War, along with the two cities wiped out by the atom bomb, the Americans and British set numerous other Japanese and German towns and cities ablaze. The destruction of the civilian population was not coincidental. what lay behind it was a precise strategic design. Dresden was attacked because it was full of refugees, women, the elderly, children, using a particular technique. First of all, windows and roofs were destroyed with high explosives, which were followed by incendiary bombs that could thereby more easily penetrate the interior of houses and set fire to carpets, curtains, furniture, and so forth. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants seems to have been abolished. Roosevelt explicitly asserted this when, as we saw earlier, he declared, quote, "We have got to be tough with Germany, and I mean the German people, not just the Nazis. We either have to castrate the German people, or if you've got to treat them in such a manner that they can't just go on reproducing people who want to continue the way they have in the past." End quote. And now let us read Stalin, who, in August 1942, while Nazi barbarism was rampaging in the USSR, was concerned to make a clear distinction. Quote, "It would be ludicrous to identify Hitler's clique with the German people, with the German state. The experience of history indicates that Hitlers come and go, but the German people and the German state remain. The strength of the Red Army lies, finally, in the fact that it does not and cannot feel racial hatred for other peoples, including the German people." End quote. Let us take a further step back. During the struggle against the Bolsheviks, the Russian whites, supported by the Entente, sparked pogroms of appalling proportions in which around 60,000 Jews lost their lives. Echoing the thesis of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, Churchill personally denounced Lenin as the high priest and head of, quote, "a formidable sect, the most formidable sect in the world." End quote. Indeed, to counter anti-Semitic agitation, the Russian revolutionary leader, in addition to taking drastic measures, mounted a major propaganda campaign and had a speech recorded on disc so that it could reach the millions of illiterates. As is well known, the October Revolution broke out in the wake of the struggle against the First World War. Wilson celebrated it as a, quote, "holy war, the holiest in all history." End quote. U.S. soldiers were crusaders, protagonists of a transcendent enterprise whose sword shone with divine light. By contrast, in addition to genocide, Rosa Luxemburg referred to an atmosphere of ritual murder, while Lenin denounced the fact that in all belligerent countries, even the home fronts had become military convict prisons. To stifle such protest, repression from above intersected with repression from below. This is a key characteristic of fascism. Thus, in the USA, the Ku Klux Klan staged a baleful return and, even after the war was over, targeted those suspected of insufficient patriotic loyalty and racial homogeneity: Jews, communists, and above all, blacks. Corresponding to the anti-Jewish pogroms incited by white Russians were cases of lynchings of blacks in the USA, which had been going on for decades. In its turn, the oppression of blacks referred back to the lot of inferior races. In 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee, with the killing of defenseless women and children, sealed the conquest of the Far West and the well-nigh complete erasure of, quote, redskins from the face of the earth. These were the years when Theodore Roosevelt thundered against sentimental humanitarians, who sympathized with the fate of the Native Americans, and who were to be regarded as worse than, quote, the professional criminal class. These were the years when, in Stalin's ringing words, quote, scores and hundreds of millions of Asiatic and African peoples usually remained outside the field of vision. White and black, civilized and uncivilized, were not put on the same plane. Only Leninism laid bare this crying incongruity, broke down the wall between whites and blacks, between Europeans and Asiatics, between the civilized and uncivilized slaves of imperialism. End quote. One more step backwards. while Europe witnessed the birth of the working class movement inspired by Marxism. In the USA, another wave of deportations removed the Native Americans ever farther west, confining them to reservations that resembled concentration camps, where it became increasingly difficult to counter hunger and the cold, and where bedclothes deliberately infected with smallpox were sometimes introduced. At the same time, in the South, blacks were slaves. In the event of rebellion, they were subjected to the most refined tortures, in accordance with an old tradition that involved roasting the victims over a slow fire, in an ordeal that could last up to 8 or 10 hours. Thus continued the, quote, idyllic proceedings, which, according to Capital, characterized, quote, the dawn of the era of capitalist production, end quote. The old slavery had not been abolished when a new form of it developed, destined to survive the Civil War: the trade in coolies imported from India and China. It was Engels who denounced this new disgrace. The history sketched above invents absolutely nothing, but it is equally ideological inasmuch as it contrasts the liberal West's concrete political conduct with the most noble aspects of the communist movement's ideological platform, ignoring its concrete behavior and the most terrible pages in its history. Yet this, in an inverted mirror image, and in even more heavily ideological fashion, is how the Black Book of Communism proceeds. It is a literary genre that ill becomes historical research. Comprehension of massive conflicts presupposes analysis of the interacting behavior of the antagonists. The presumption on the part of one of the interested parties, the one that emerged victorious, to erect itself into judge of the other, condemning it on the basis of criteria to which it declines to submit, is ridiculous. Rather than a work of history, the Black Book of Communism is a kind of historiographical caricature of the Nuremberg trial. End section.